retrieve a piece of evidence?
Yes. You're looking for
The photographs of the actors. And may I reserve any remaining time for 5 minutes for rebuttal?
Yes.
Thank you.
Get through that?
Mhm.
Okay.
These photos show you exactly how Vanessa Sullivan died. Every gruesome detail of the crash, every shattered sliver of glass, every warped piece of metal can be seen in the photographs that we offered as State's Exhibit 1. These photos can't show you the real damage that was done. To understand that, there are other snapshots you need to see, photos we don't have. Of Vanessa's empty dorm, where her roommate now lives alone. Of the empty seat now left at the Sullivan family dinner table, the empty frame that should have been Vanessa's college diploma. It was easy to lose sight of it. To forget that when that Impala ran off the road, a woman's very future was derailed right along with it. And the reason it was easy to forget is that when it came down to it, the defendant didn't let any of that stop her from making dangerous choice after dangerous choice that night. Choices that you've seen today had deadly consequences. And that's why, members of the jury, the defendant has been charged not only with a DUI, but also with Miss Sullivan's murder. Now it's true. The defendant didn't shoot or stab her victim. And there's no evidence. The defendant wanted Miss Sullivan dead, as you heard from Mr. Love in his opening statement. Opposing counsel is right. But no matter what the defense asks you to believe here today, this case simply does not hinge on the simple question of whether their client was trying to hurt the victim or not. As you're going to hear from the judge in just a minute, the real question here today was this: did the defendant act with an extreme and reckless indifference for human life? In other words, members of the jury, did she roll the dice that night without caring who got them? We prove beyond any reasonable doubt that is exactly what she did. And under Midland's law, that means we prove she's guilty of murder. So let's walk through how we prove it, using the 3 choices my co-counsel, Mr. Ross, asked you to keep in mind at the beginning of today's trial. First, the choice to drink too much. From the get-go, opposing counsel has been trying to tell you their client wasn't actually that drunk. In opening statement, Mr. Love stood right where I'm standing now, and he said, sure, Danny had a couple drinks that night, but she wasn't out of control. His words, members of the jury. These are not the bar tabs of somebody who was in control. These aren't even the bar tabs of somebody who was coherent at the end of the night. Those are not the glasses of somebody who was okay to get behind the wheel. And no matter how much the defense's witness, Jordan James, gets up on that stand today and tries to minimize for his friend and his customer, no matter how many of the 19 drinks bought by the defendant, Mr. James claims were sent to other people in the bar, his actions that night speak louder than his words from the witness stand ever could. Because Mr. James admitted, on that night, in the moment, he didn't think the defendant should have a pair of darts in his hand, much less a steering. Members of the jury, maybe you're not convinced by what Jordan James thought. After all, the fact that Jordan James thought the defendant was drunk doesn't prove that Danny Dawson herself thought she was drunk. But what does, members of the jury, is the defendant's own behavior that night. Everything she did that night reveals she too realized she had no business getting behind the wheel. Why? When she walked out of the bar and got into that vehicle, was the first thing she said to Taylor Hobson, "We're taking the back roads. I do not want to run into the cops tonight." Why, members of the jury, when taken back to the police station, when given the chance to prove her sobriety with a simple exhale, did the defendant refuse? Did she say no? The answer is simple. It's because the defendant was drunk and she knew it, members of the jury. Which brings us to our second point. Even knowing she was drunk, she chose to get behind the wheel. Members of the jury, when you mess something up, it's hard to find an easy way to cancel out the damage you've done. No harm, no foul. But the defendant had that chance on September 20th. Because when she walked out of the bar, there was a taxi cab sitting, waiting, beckoning the defendant. The cab driver literally called out to her, "Can I give you a ride?" And if Miss Dawson had just had the sense to say yes, it wouldn't matter how much she'd had to drink that night. Because whether she tossed back 2 or 12 or 20, if Vanessa Sullivan is in Mr. Lyons' cab, she's getting home safe. Think about that. The defendant dropped almost $100 on alcohol that night. And for a few bucks, she could have effectively guaranteed Miss Sullivan's safety. But instead, she chose to lead her victim over to a 2-ton death trap with a steering wheel and an accelerator, because that's what 4,000 pounds of metal is. When you whip it along a path, you couldn't walk without falling. If that the choice to risk Miss Sullivan's safety when the safe option was right there for the taking, if that's not extreme indifference to human life, what is? And that brings us around to our third choice, the defendant's choice to drive dangerously. Members of the jury, me. Even after all the drinking, if the defendant had displayed even an ounce of caution that night, maybe then we could talk about her behavior being manslaughter and not murder. But she couldn't even do that. Because as you heard from the defense's own paid expert witness, Dr. Leslie Rahul, who sat right here on this stand today, the defendant was going at least 16 miles per hour over the speed limit at night, in the rain, on a road that had claimed lives before. And the defense wants to stand up here and point to those things as excuses. The dark, the rain, the road, as if somehow their client were unaware that it's dangerous to drive at night in the rain on a curvy road where people have died speeding before. And sure, if it had gotten dark real quick, or if the rain had come out of nowhere, maybe then they'd had the beginning of a decent argument, but that is not what happened. When Miss Dawson left the bar, it was already drunk. When Miss Dawson left the bar, it was already drained. When Miss Dawson chose to take Canyon Road, she knew people had died back there before. Mr. Lyons told you. He had said that to her directly. And Miss Dawson admitted it from the stand here today. She was aware of all of it. And even still, even knowing that the odds were stacked against her, how dangerous it was to drive back there, even with Miss Hobson begging her from the back seat, please slow down. The defendant was speeding 16 miles per hour over the speed limit. And it's those choices. The choices to be a daredevil in the face of danger. The choice to be flippant in the face of Taylor Hobson and Vanessa Sullivan's fear that shows you the indifference she acted with that night. She made dangerous choice after dangerous choice. And now a young woman is dead. It's why we're asked to find the defendant guilty of Miss Sullivan's murder. Thank you.
Mr. Green?
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, permission to remove this demonstrator?
Yes. Move on. You can do what you want. I guess you open the legs of that table.
May I proceed?
Yes.
64 questions. Mr. Mr. Wallace got up here on the cross-examination of Miss Danielle Dawson, and he asked her 64 different questions. And then we learned that those were 64 questions the police never bothered to ask her themselves. So our question for the prosecution: why didn't Officer Foster interview Miss Dawson? If she had, what would she have learned? Would she have learned why Miss Dawson drove off the side of the road? Would she have learned how many drinks Miss Dawson had? Would she have learned how long it took her to consume those different drinks? Would we even be in court today? The problem for the prosecution is that those were just a few of the unanswered questions. This was a case about those unanswered questions. Now, the reason that those questions are so important is because here in court, it's the prosecution that has the burden of proof. Members of the jury, it seems that there was a point during today's trial where they forgot that fact. They got up here on the cross-examination of Miss Dawson. They said the police asked you to prove you were sober. They asked you to prove you were innocent. Those were their words. In this country, members of the jury, that's not how the law works. Because on September 24th, it was the police's job to prove Miss Dawson was not sober. And here in court, it was the prosecution's job to prove she was guilty. But there were three unanswered questions. Three questions that kept the prosecution from meeting their burden of proof. And I want to walk you through each of those questions one at a time. Starting with the first. Was Miss Dawson actually intoxicated? Today, the prosecution, they called several witnesses to the stand. They tried to tell you, yes, Miss Dawson had drink after drink after drink, but did they actually ever give us a number? Miss Hobson told us, I couldn't remember how many she had. I was drinking myself. Mr. Lyons told us at first I saw her have 2 drinks, and then maybe she had more. I'm not sure. And then we learned that Officer Foster performed sobriety tests on Miss Dawson. The prosecution, they chose to call Officer Ryan Foster to the stand. Miss Dawson told you that Officer Foster asked her to walk in a straight line. Officer Foster asked her to stand on one leg. Officer Foster asked her to touch her hands to her nose. The prosecution, they want to make this case about choices. They chose to call Officer Foster to the stand. Why didn't they ask her how Miss Dawson performed on those sobriety tests? Did she fail? Did she pass? What were they trying to keep from us? That's reasonable doubt. Now, they tried to tell you that these receipts, well, they proved Miss Dawson had 19 alcoholic drinks, but members of the jury, we know that just because you order a drink doesn't mean you drank it. Just last night, me and my friends, we went out to Grimaldi's Pizza. And now Mr. Love, he did something uncharacteristic. Something he doesn't usually do. He decided to be generous. He bought the 3 of us a round of drinks. And even though I had one and Mr. Thacker had his, Mr. Love paid for all 3 of them. And we know that's what happened on September 24th. It was Vanessa Sullivan's 21st birthday. Are we really to believe that the birthday girl bought her own drinks? Which brings us to question number 2. Was Miss Dawson actually driving recklessly? Today you heard from Officer Foster. She told you that if she thought Miss Dawson was actually driving dangerously, she would have pulled that car over. Regardless of any 1001 call, regardless of any other officer in distress, if she thought that car needed to be off the road, she would have pulled it over first. She didn't pull Miss Dawson over for drunk driving. She didn't pull Miss Dawson over for speeding. She didn't pull Miss Dawson over for anything. The prosecution, they want you to believe that Miss Dawson drove so recklessly that it constitutes murder, didn't drive recklessly enough to get pulled over for a speeding ticket? Question number 3. Why did Miss Dawson actually swerve? Today we learned from Professor Roman that Officer Ryan Foster, yes, the same Officer Ryan Foster you heard from in court today, the same Officer Foster that failed to mention sobriety tests, also performed an accident reconstruction. The prosecution chose to call Officer Foster to the stand. They decided not to ask her about that reconstruction. They didn't ask her about the data that she collected. They didn't ask her about the measurements she took. What were they trying to hide? That's reasonable doubt. We learned from Professor Roman that speed couldn't have been the cause of the accident. There's just too much we don't know. Did Miss Dawson drive off the side of the road because in those sheets of pouring rain, she couldn't see in front of her? We don't know. Did Miss Dawson swerve because her car hydroplaned on the wet pavement and she just lost control? We don't know. Is it like Miss Dawson said, she swerved because some animal jumped in front of her car and in that moment she had no choice but to swerve? We don't know. Members of the jury, we don't know. After we don't know. After we don't know does not add up to proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, in just a moment, Mr. Wallace will have a chance to get up here and give his rebuttal. We ask that he answer 3 very specific questions. I've written them down right here. Put them on this piece of paper. I'm going to read them aloud to you. Why didn't they ask Officer Foster about field sobriety tests? Why didn't they ask Officer Foster about accident reconstruction? Why didn't Officer Foster pull over Danielle Dawson? Members of the jury, I'm going to put these questions right here. This is where Officer Foster sat. This is where those questions went unanswered. This is where they failed to ask them. We hope that for once in today's trial, the prosecution will actually try to answer some questions. And at the end of today's trial, when they fail to answer those questions, when those questions remain unanswered, we ask that you find Miss Dawson not guilty. Thank you.
Wallace?
Can I ask how much time I have?
You guys, how much time for rebuttal?
43 seconds.
Opposing counsel just smacked that piece of paper down, accused us of trying to hide something from him. Funny then that the first thing he did when he stood up here was take all these cups and hide them behind this podium as though you would forget what his client had done. What else did he try to hide from you? How about the fact that no eyewitness to this crash ever saw the deer they claim was there? How about the fact that the defendant chose to speed 16 miles per hour over the speed limit, as her own witness said, down a road she knew had killed people before? Do not let Miss Dawson hide behind questions that have already been answered. We know she was drunk. We know she was speeding. She murdered Vanessa Sullivan. Find her guilty.
All right, thank you. I want the judges complete the blue ballot.